In the markets of New Orleans and Boston in the 1890s, a banana was still a small marvel, a curve of sunlight that arrived from a latitude most buyers would never see. It was cheap enough to be casual, delicate enough to bruise, and perishable enough to expose a hard truth of the modern age. Distance is not measured in miles, but in spoilage. Whoever could make a fragile fruit travel on schedule could make almost anything travel on schedule, including money and power. South of the Gulf, the republics of Central America were young in years and old in burdens. Independence had delivered flags and constitutions faster than it delivered roads, ports, courts, or stable revenue. Governments lived close to the edge of their own cash boxes. Customs houses were the great arteries of finance, because import duties could be collected at a dock in a way that land taxes could not be collected in the hills. When treasuries ran thin, presidents borrowed abroad, pledged future receipts, and tried to purchase development with promises that matured long after administrations had fallen. To turn geography into prosperity required steel and steam. The interior had coffee, timber, and cattle. The coast had ships. Between them lay mountains, rain, jungle, and fever. A railroad was not only a transportation project, but a wager against nature, made with borrowed money and paid for in bodies. Yet once tracks were laid, they did something quietly revolutionary. They made certain land count. They pulled towns into existence, pushed others into irrelevance, and created a narrow corridor where the life of a nation could be made to pass, crate by crate, tariff by tariff. The banana fit this new world perfectly. It grew fast, it yielded heavily, and it demanded obedience to time. It could not wait for politics. It could not wait for a civil war or a ministerial reshuffle or a bridge dispute between provinces. It required roads, rail spurs, docks, warehouses, and ships with schedules that did not pause for speeches. A trade in bananas therefore grew into a trade in reliability, and reliability in a poor state is never merely commercial. It becomes political. At first, the arrangement seemed almost friendly. Local governments wanted railways and ports, foreign investors wanted concessions that made risk tolerable. Tax exemptions were granted like aspirin for headaches. Land was offered in long strips along the right-of-way because land was plentiful on paper, and paper was what officials had. A company would promise track, telegraph, and employment. A president would promise stability, protection, and favorable terms. Each believed they were using the other. Each was partly right. But the real transformation began when a business stopped being a customer of the state and became the builder of the state's most valuable functions. A firm that owned the rail line could decide what reached the port. A firm that managed the dock could decide what shipped and what waited. A firm that housed the workforce could decide whether a strike was a complaint or a catastrophe. When the treasury depended on one export stream, control of the stream began to resemble a form of sovereignty exercised without uniforms. By the end of the century, the fruit trade in the Caribbean basin was no longer a scatter of adventurous shipments. It was becoming a system. Plantations linked to private rails, rails linked to private ports, ports linked to private ships, ships linked to northern markets, and all of it protected by contracts that outlasted elections. In boardrooms far from the tropics, men began to see that the greatest asset was not the banana itself, but the corridor that made the banana inevitable. In one capital after another, ink met paper under ceiling fans that did little against the heat. A government signed away a concession to secure a railroad it could not afford. A businessman accepted land that looked worthless until the track made it priceless. Somewhere along a humid coast, surveyors placed stakes in the soil, and a line that seemed at first like mere infrastructure began to take on a second meaning. It marked the beginning of a partnership in which the weaker party did not yet understand what it had agreed to be. On the Caribbean side of Costa Rica, where the mountains fall toward the sea and the air clings to the skin like a damp cloth, the railroad appeared first as an act of national aspiration. San Jose sat inland, orderly and self-regarding, with coffee wealth in its veins and a stubborn belief that the country could step into modernity by laying iron across geography. The contract to push a line from the capital toward the Atlantic was, on paper, a rational bargain. Foreign capital and expertise would build, the Republic would repay. In reality, it was a march into terrain that behaved like an adversary. The jungle did not simply surround the project, it participated in it. Rain turned cuts into slides. Rivers rearranged themselves in the wet season as if offended by surveyors. Mosquitoes made their own census. A labor camp in the lowlands was a temporary city of men, tools, and fever, where a week's schedule could be erased overnight by illness. Those who survived learned an education no university offered. How fragile a budget becomes when each day of delay has an interest rate. The figure who mattered here was not a general or a minister, but an entrepreneur with a talent for endurance and arithmetic. He learned, as many learned in that era, that building a railroad in the tropics was not primarily an engineering problem. It was a financing problem conducted under biological pressure. You had to keep men fed and paid while the jungle tried to empty your payroll by killing it. You had to keep suppliers willing to extend credit while your own invoices came due, and you had to persuade a government, perpetually tempted to change its mind, to keep honoring a contract when its own opponents promised to repudiate it. Along the right-of-way, bananas grew easily. They did not require the patience of coffee or the prestige of sugar. They rose fast, heavy with fruit, indifferent to the political speeches in the capital. At first they were planted as a practical solution, food for workers, a way to soften the cost of feeding a camp at the edge of the map. But a simple observation soon hardened into strategy. A railroad that could not yet deliver paying freight could still deliver bananas. A ship that came for imported goods could leave with fruit. The banana's virtue was not only that it was edible, it was that it turned delay into revenue. In the ledger books of a developing republic, there are two numbers that quarrel like siblings. One is the cost of building the future. The other is the cost of keeping the present from collapsing while you build it. Bananas, planted beside the track, began to reconcile those numbers. They were money that grew without waiting for the state to become competent. The same logic was unfolding elsewhere around the Caribbean, in places with different flags and the same constraints. Jamaica and the coastal lowlands of Central America had long exported sugar and coffee under systems that rewarded large estates and punished smallholders. But the banana was a different crop in its political temperament. It created value quickly and demanded constant motion. It did not ask a government for protection in the abstract. It asked for a dock that worked, a rail spur that ran, a customs officer who did not invent new fees every month, and soldiers who would not set up roadblocks because they hadn't been paid. In Boston and New Orleans, the banana arrived as a test of logistics. Merchants learned that the season of bananas could be written not by climate alone, but by shipping lines and timetables. They learned that to sell fruit at a price that would make it ordinary, you had to remove uncertainty as if it were a disease. That required a new kind of business, not a trader buying what farmers happened to grow, but an organization that could shape what was grown, how it was packed, when it was shipped, and how quickly it reached a consumer who had never heard of the place it came from. The first generation of banana men were often improvisers, captains who bought fruit from wharves, merchants who wagered their savings on a perishable cargo, small syndicates that learned by losing money. Their successes were noisy and brief. A storm could erase a season. A glut could ruin a price. A politician could decide that your concession now belonged to his cousin. But some of these men, by temperament and by luck, learned a larger lesson. The profit was not in the fruit alone. It was in owning the conditions under which fruit could be safely sold. By the late 1890s, the elements of a larger organism lay scattered in different hands. There were plantations in the lowlands, some grown out of railroad concessions, some hacked out of forest by local families, some already controlled by foreign firms. There were docks, often crude, sometimes improved by private money because governments had other fires to put out. There were ships, which needed to be run not as occasional ventures, but as fleets with predictable schedules. There were distribution networks in the United States where the banana was becoming a habit, and habits, once formed, punish any interruption with immediate loss of market share. In 1899, these scattered elements were gathered under one corporate roof, with a steadiness that made the transition look cleaner than it was. A merger does not require gunfire. It requires agreement about who will control the paperwork. The new company that emerged, United Fruit, was, on its face, a commercial enterprise. Yet its real innovation was structural. It stitched together land, transportation, and sales into a single chain of command. It was not content to buy bananas. It intended to manufacture reliability. To make that reliability visible, it put ships on the water that were as much symbols as they were vehicles. White-hulled steamers began to move between Caribbean ports and American cities with a regularity that governments in the region often failed to achieve in their own administrations. The phrase, "the Great White Fleet," sounded like a navy, and in a sense it functioned like one. A floating arm of a corporate empire, disciplined by schedules, insulated by capital, indifferent to local politics except where local politics interfered with delivery. What United Fruit was assembling was a private version of the infrastructure states are supposed to provide. It was building the roads that mattered, the communications that mattered, the clinics that mattered, the pay systems that mattered. The company did not need to abolish local sovereignty. It needed only to occupy the practical spaces where sovereignty becomes real, the ability to move goods, collect revenue, and compel labor. In the capitals of Central America, this occupation was often welcomed in the way a drowning man welcomes a rope, without asking who holds the other end. A minister could point to a new rail line, a new pier, a stream of export receipts, and present them as proof of progress. A president could distribute jobs and favors in the company's orbit and thereby strengthen his own patronage network. For a time, the arrangement satisfied both sides. The company got what it required: exemptions, land, predictable customs treatment, and protection. The government got what it could not easily produce: development without immediate taxation. But there was an asymmetry embedded in the bargain. The company could outlast a government because its planning horizon was measured in decades and its leadership did not change with elections. Governments could not easily outlast the company because their budgets were annual, their coalitions fragile, and their debts unforgiving. If a president pushed too hard, he could be replaced. If a minister threatened expropriation, he could find himself without allies once the pay envelopes stopped moving. The arrangement also created a geography of dependence. The banana zone became a world unto itself, a coastal strip where company rails ran past company housing to company docks, with company stores and company doctors and company rules. The interior could argue about ideology, elections, and national destiny. The lowlands concerned themselves with rainfall, output, and the arrival of ships. In this separation lay a subtle political consequence. The most profitable part of the country began to live outside the emotional and administrative reach of the state. In Honduras, where politics was often conducted with a mixture of formal titles and informal weapons, an American writer briefly observed the scene and put a phrase to what he saw. He had fled legal trouble in the north and found in the tropics a kind of nervous comedy. Governments that changed hands quickly, armies that were small but decisive, businessmen who made and unmade alliances as if politics were an extension of trade. When his book appeared in 1904, he called one of these imagined states a banana republic, and the phrase, meant as satire, endured because it named a truth that could be recognized across borders. The phrase did not describe poverty alone. Many poor countries are not banana republics. It described a particular political economy, a state whose fiscal life is tied to one export corridor, an elite whose stability depends on pleasing foreign creditors and foreign firms, a public sphere where national politics is fierce, but the economic foundations are negotiated elsewhere. It described, in short, a republic with the external trappings of sovereignty and the internal habits of dependence. To understand how a corporation could become the quiet co-author of such a state, one must look at how concessions worked in practice. A concession was not simply a permit to do business. It was often a bundle of rights: land grants along rail lines, long leases on ports, tax exemptions that could last generations, guarantees against certain forms of regulation, and sometimes control over immigration and policing within the company's zone. These were granted because governments needed something now: cash, a railroad, a foreign loan made possible by demonstrating development. The cost would be paid later, by officials not yet in office and citizens not yet aware of what had been given away. In the lowlands, the company's authority could feel more immediate than the state's. The paymaster mattered more than the tax collector. The foreman's word mattered more than a distant judge's decree. If a worker wanted to complain, he complained to a superintendent, not a minister. If a small farmer wanted to ship produce, he negotiated with a rail office, not a public works department. The state, in these zones, became an occasional visitor, present when there was an election to influence, a strike to suppress, or a customs dispute to resolve. United Fruit's executives learned that they did not need to purchase governments outright. They needed only to create conditions under which governments would choose, again and again, to act in the company's interest. The most effective bribe is not a suitcase of cash, but a budget line that collapses if you displease the wrong party. If customs receipts depended on the company's exports, then the treasury itself became a hostage to corporate satisfaction. The company did not need to threaten. It could simply delay shipments, slow investment, or shift production elsewhere. This ability to shift was one of its greatest weapons. A banana plantation is not a castle. It can be abandoned. The company could move to a different valley, a different coast, a different country, leaving behind unemployed towns and empty rail spurs. Governments, by contrast, could not move their populations. They could not relocate their debt. They could not easily replace an export industry that had been built as an enclave. Mobility, in the age of capital, became a form of power. There were, of course, limits. A company might own the rails, but it could not change the weather. It could not prevent hurricanes. It could not bargain with plant diseases. The banana's very productivity made it vulnerable. Plantations concentrated monoculture in a way that invited catastrophe. A fungus or blight could behave like an invading army, sweeping through fields and forcing relocation. The banana thus taught the company another lesson. It must be able to abandon and replant at scale. This reinforced the need for vast landholdings and political permissions that made such movement possible. The labor system that grew under these conditions was as modern as it was primitive. It was modern in its organization: payrolls, job classifications, supply chains, time clocks, and managerial hierarchies. It was primitive in its bargaining power. Workers were recruited from local villages and from the Caribbean islands, brought into zones where the company controlled housing and food, and paid in ways designed to keep them dependent. In some places, company scrip and company stores turned wages into a closed circuit, money issued by the employer, spent at the employer's commissary, often at prices the worker did not set. The worker's freedom was real in theory and narrowed in practice. The company town was a lesson in social geometry. It placed Americans and local elites in separate neighborhoods, often on higher ground or in better ventilated areas, with screened porches and imported comforts. Workers lived closer to the fields, closer to standing water, closer to the insects that turned evenings into risk. Even leisure was organized. A baseball field might appear, a cinema screen, a small hospital. These were not gifts. They were instruments of stability, investments in keeping labor available and unrest manageable. When reformers and critics later described United Fruit as an octopus, they were not only being poetic. The company's reach was not a single line of command, but a set of tentacles that touched transport, employment, land ownership, local policing, and foreign diplomacy. It did not require direct rule to be dominant. It required a network of leverage points distributed across the life of a state. One of the most important tentacles extended northward into Washington. The United States in these decades was not yet an empire in the old European sense, but it was becoming an imperial power of a new type, one that insisted publicly on ideals and privately on stability for trade and investment. The Monroe Doctrine had begun as a warning to European monarchies. By the early 20th century, under new interpretations, it could also serve as a rationale for American intervention in the hemisphere. In the language of the day, interventions were for order, for debt repayment, for the protection of life and property. In practice, they often stabilized conditions favorable to American firms. Dollar diplomacy was the polite phrase for a policy that treated American finance as a tool of foreign relations. The logic was simple. If American banks and companies were deeply invested in a country, the United States would have a reason to care about that country's stability, and the country would have a reason to accommodate American preferences. It was a partnership between capital and state, presented as mutually beneficial and lived, in the tropics, as a narrowing of options. For United Fruit, this partnership was not a conspiracy so much as an alignment of interests. When a strike threatened production, the company could appeal to local authorities, who feared lost revenue and elite displeasure. If local authorities hesitated, the company could appeal to its own government's diplomats, who might warn that American property was at risk. The possibility of U.S. Marines arriving to protect lives hovered in the background like a shadow that did not need to speak. Often it was enough that everyone knew it was there. The company's executives did not think of themselves as governors. They thought of themselves as practical men managing a fragile business. And it is precisely this self-image that made their power durable. A tyrant knows he rules and invites resistance. A corporation insists it merely operates, and resistance looks, to some observers, like irrationality. Why disturb commerce? Why threaten jobs? Why scare investors? The corporation's power thus hides in a moral argument. It is only asking to be left alone to create prosperity. Not everyone accepted this argument. Local nationalists, journalists, and labor organizers spoke of sovereignty and exploitation. They saw that development often meant foreign ownership of the best land and the best routes. They saw that profits left the country more reliably than taxes stayed. They saw that local politicians, when they needed money, negotiated away the future in exchange for the present. But reformers faced their own constraint. The state was weak not because of a single bad president, but because of inherited structures. Tax systems were narrow. Elites resisted land taxes. Armies were small and often politicized. Roads and courts did not extend easily into the lowlands. A reformist government could inherit patriotic ideals and still find itself dependent on customs receipts drawn from the same export streams controlled by foreign firms. To confront the company, you needed a state strong enough to survive the confrontation. That was the circular trap. In Honduras, the trap became a kind of theater repeated with variations. A president in trouble, a rival with friends and weapons, foreign businessmen calculating which side will protect their concessions, and a small war that decides who gets to sign the next set of papers. Elections mattered, but they mattered inside a larger contest over who controlled the revenue arteries. In New Orleans, around the same time, a different kind of banana man was rising. Less bureaucratic than United Fruit's executives, more willing to gamble, more comfortable with improvised force. He began as a trader, buying overripe bananas and selling them quickly, making profit from speed and waste. He learned the business from the street level. What could be salvaged? What could be moved? What could be done with a cargo that had only days before it became compost? This made him attentive to margins and indifferent to delicacy. As his ambitions grew, he pushed into the same political terrain United Fruit was learning to manage: concessions, rail lines, friendly officials. But where United Fruit preferred contracts and continuity, this upstart understood that in some places power could be purchased more cheaply through political change than through negotiation. In 1911, when an opportunity presented itself in Honduras, he did not merely lobby, he helped finance an armed venture that would install a more accommodating leader. There were ships, weapons, and men with the casual skills of adventurers. The episode was small in military terms and large in implication. It demonstrated that in a weak state, a businessman could treat a presidency as a variable in his supply chain. It is tempting to see this as an exotic scandal of a distant era, but the logic was modern. If your profits depended on a concession signed by one man, then the identity of that man became a business concern. If the state could not guarantee continuity, the firm might manufacture continuity by influencing who held office. The methods could range from patronage to lobbying to, in the crudest cases, sponsored violence. The underlying motive remained consistent: reduce political uncertainty until it resembles a line item. United Fruit watched such episodes with a mixture of disapproval and interest. Disorder was bad for business, but sometimes disorder produced a better contract. The company's preference was to make itself indispensable to whichever government was in power, so that each administration, regardless of ideology, would find it easier to cooperate than to confront. But when rivals played rough, the company could not remain a purely commercial spectator. Competition in the banana trade was not merely about price, it was about geography, concessions, and state favor. In the tropics, market share could be won by outmaneuvering a competitor in a parliament as easily as on a dock. The human cost of this game was paid in the lowlands. On a plantation, politics was not a debate, but a work rhythm. The day began early because the heat punished delay. Bunches were cut, carried, and hung on lines. Trains or carts moved fruit to packing sheds where hands worked quickly, aware that bruises became losses. The company's systems were designed to eliminate waste, and in doing so, they disciplined labor. A man who slowed production was not only disobedient, he was expensive. The most striking feature of this labor world was its combination of modern planning and social crudeness. Managers kept careful records and treated workers as interchangeable units. Yet they often regarded those same workers through the stereotypes of empire: locals as unreliable, West Indians as useful but suspect, Americans as natural supervisors. Segregation, both formal and informal, organized space. The company might build a hospital and yet pay wages that made sickness financially disastrous. It might provide housing and yet control the terms of residency with an authority a landlord in the North could envy. Workers were not ignorant of this arrangement. They could see who ate well and who did not. They could see that the company had its own police and its own rules. They could see that appeals to distant courts were slow and uncertain, while the foreman's decision was immediate. Over time, these observations became grievances, and grievances, when shared, became politics of a different kind, the politics of organization. Labor organization in the banana zones faced obstacles that were almost designed into the landscape. Populations were mobile. Workers came for a season and left. Company towns isolated workers from urban centers where unions could form. The state's presence was thin, and when it appeared, it often appeared as soldiers, not as inspectors. Yet the very scale of the enterprise created its own vulnerability. A small farmer could be ignored. 10,000 workers who stopped cutting fruit could not be ignored. The banana's insistence on time meant that a strike, if coordinated, could turn into a crisis quickly. This is why strikes were treated not as disputes, but as threats to sovereignty, though whose sovereignty was being defended was often unclear. Governments feared that prolonged unrest would collapse customs revenue and invite foreign pressure. Elites feared that labor demands would spread beyond the banana zone into coffee plantations and urban factories. The company feared not only immediate losses, but the precedent. If workers succeeded here, they might succeed elsewhere. Each side therefore tended to escalate, not because it was irrational, but because it was trapped by the logic of example. In Guatemala, where the long rule of a single strongman could turn the state into a personal instrument, United Fruit's relationship with government showed another face of the same dynamic. A ruler who could guarantee stability over many years was valuable to a corporation that planned decades ahead. In exchange for concessions, the company gained the predictability investors craved. For the ruler, the company was a source of revenue and international legitimacy, a sign that progress was underway. The cost was borne by those excluded from the bargain: small farmers displaced by land grants, workers disciplined by a private authority, and a political culture trained to treat foreign capital as an arbiter of what was realistic. By the 1920s, the banana had completed its journey from curiosity to staple in the United States. It sat on kitchen tables and in lunch pails, eaten without ceremony, as ordinary as an apple. This ordinariness was itself a triumph of organization. It meant that ships had run on time, that plantations had produced consistently, that ports had functioned, and that the chain of spoilage had been managed. The consumer saw only the final smooth surface. The bruises were hidden overseas. United Fruit had become, in effect, a bank in the tropics, though not a bank in the narrow sense of taking deposits. It financed infrastructure through its investments, and those investments became leverage. It extended credit indirectly by offering jobs and wages in regions with few alternatives. It shaped government revenue by controlling export flows. It influenced political outcomes by rewarding cooperation and punishing hostility. It held land as a reserve of future opportunity. Like a bank, it could wait. Like a bank, it could decide who would be solvent. It was also learning the value of narrative. In the North, the company presented itself as a civilizing force, bringing development to backward regions, introducing modern agriculture, building ports, and providing employment. This was not entirely false. The company did build, it did employ. It did introduce logistics that local states had not achieved. The deception lay not in the list of accomplishments, but in what was omitted. That development built as an enclave can strengthen a corporation more than a nation. That employment tied to private infrastructure can create dependence as deep as debt. That modernization conducted without political sovereignty becomes a form of private rule. Nowhere were these contradictions more stark than in Colombia, a country larger and more institutionally developed than many of its Central American neighbors, and therefore a place where the company's methods would be tested against a state with a stronger sense of itself. On Colombia's Caribbean coast, near the towns of Santa Marta and Ciénaga, banana plantations expanded into what became known simply as the Banana Zone. The geography was favorable: flat land, access to ports, and a river network that could be adapted to transport. United Fruit operated there through local arrangements and subsidiaries, careful to embed itself in the region's economy. The workers of the Banana Zone lived under the familiar architecture of the enclave. Many were hired through contractors, which allowed the company to keep formal responsibility at arm's length. Pay systems were organized to keep labor flexible and costs controllable. Housing and stores tied workers to the company's orbit. Over time, the same grievances accumulated: payment practices that felt arbitrary, a lack of recognized bargaining channels, long hours, and the sense that a foreign firm could dictate terms while the national state looked away. In late 1928, these grievances converged into a strike. Workers presented demands that were, by the standards of an industrializing world, unremarkable. More direct employment rather than contractor mediation, wages paid in cash rather than through systems that could be manipulated, recognition of their organization, and basic improvements in conditions. The company resisted, arguing that concessions would raise costs and invite similar demands elsewhere. Local authorities hesitated, aware that the strike threatened revenue and order. The situation tightened. The banana's clock was ticking. Fruit does not negotiate. As the strike dragged on, pressure rose not only from the coast, but from the north. American diplomats watched the disruption with the sensitivity that comes when commerce and national prestige are intertwined. The specter of intervention, of Marines arriving to protect Americans, was not a plan that needed to be announced. It was a possibility that shaped decisions simply by existing. Colombia's government faced a familiar dilemma dressed in national colors: concede to labor and risk appearing weak, or suppress labor and preserve production, stability, and foreign confidence. The decision, like many decisions in such moments, was made by institutions whose primary fear was disorder. Troops were moved. A public gathering was treated as a security threat. The state, trained to see crowds as potential rebellion, responded with the instrument it trusted most. In the early hours of December 6, 1928, in Ciénaga, soldiers opened fire on a crowd of workers and their families who had gathered near the train station. The official tally would later acknowledge dozens of deaths. In the towns and plantations, the number spoke of itself in a different way, whispered as hundreds, remembered as a wound too large for exact accounting. The precise count matters to historians and bureaucrats. The political meaning was clear to everyone who lived through it. When the moment came, the state had placed its bullets on the side of the export system. In the days that followed, fear did what fear always does. It spread faster than truth. Some fled, some returned to work, some disappeared into the countryside. The strike collapsed under the combined weight of force and uncertainty. For the company, production resumed. For Colombia, the episode entered the bloodstream of national memory, resurfacing in later decades as symbol and accusation. The banana had been made ordinary in the United States. In the banana zone, it had been made sacred in blood. The massacre did not solve the underlying problem, it revealed it. It showed that a private enterprise, by anchoring itself to revenue and infrastructure, could make a national government act as its enforcer. It also showed the company something it had been learning in smaller ways, that violence, even when outsourced to the state, comes with costs that are not measured only in lost labor days. It produces headlines, outrage, investigations, and reputational risk. It turns business into politics in a way that cannot be fully controlled by contracts. United Fruit had built its early power in the visible world. Plantations, rails, docks, ships, concessions signed under ceiling fans. In Colombia, it saw what that power looked like when the bill came due in public. The company would continue to rely on the old instruments, land, logistics, leverage, but it would increasingly cultivate new ones. Influence that traveled through newspapers, through lobbyists, through diplomats, through the careful framing of disputes as something larger than wages and land. The banana zone had taught the company to govern space. The next lesson would be how to govern perception, and how to make distant governments, its own most of all, see its private interests as synonymous with order itself. In the years after Cienaga, the fruit business learned the discipline that all scandals teach. It is not enough to win. One must also appear to deserve winning. A company could survive a massacre more easily than it could survive a permanent reputation for needing massacres. The banana's weakness, its short life, had forced the industry to master time. Now the industry's other weakness, its visibility, forced it to master narrative. The world economy, meanwhile, was entering its own season of rot. The Great Depression did not arrive in Central America as an abstraction. It arrived as falling prices, shrinking credit, and the sudden discovery that a nation cannot eat its export receipts when export receipts disappear. Governments that had lived on customs duties watched imports decline and revenues thin. Debts still matured on schedule. Revolutions, in such years, became not only ideological, but fiscal, a desperate attempt to find a solvent order when the old one had become insolvent. United Fruit, for all its ships and railroads, was not immune. Demand in the north could sag. Capital markets could close. Mismanagement that had been tolerable in fat years became fatal in lean ones. The company's stock sank, and with it the aura of inevitability that had protected it. It had built an empire that could outlast presidents. It now had to prove it could outlast a depression. In New Orleans lived a man who had made his first fortune by understanding that Americans would buy bananas too ripe, too bruised, too cheap, if you moved them fast enough. He had begun at the edge of the trade, scavenging value from what others considered waste, and then climbed into the higher air of plantations, ships, and politics. Earlier, when he had wanted a more favorable Honduran government, he had not written an editorial. He had helped finance an expedition. He knew the tropics the way a gambler knows the felt of a table, by touch, by risk, by the look on a man's face when he is bluffing. Samuel Zemurray had sold his own banana company to United Fruit for stock just before the Depression began its work. He had retired into a mansion, as if wealth were a door you could close behind you. But the Depression made the stock certificate an instrument of disappointment. United Fruit's value collapsed, and Zemurray, holding a large stake, watched his paper fortune bleed. He returned to the business not as a romantic comeback, but as an act of self-defense. The boardrooms of a great corporation can be as dramatic as battlefields, though the weapons are proxies and the casualties are careers. Zemery gathered votes, turned shareholders, and took control. The man who had once operated like a private adventurer now sat at the head of the table of the largest fruit empire on earth, tasked with rescuing it from its own habits. The irony was almost too neat. The company that had grown by mastering government instability now found itself threatened by managerial instability within. He reorganized with the blunt intelligence of a man who did not confuse hierarchy with wisdom. The enterprise became less centralized, more responsive, less ornamental. The company survived, which in business is a kind of victory that produces no parades. But survival had a cost. It made the company more conscious of how quickly confidence can evaporate. If the North could lose faith in a corporation, the South could lose faith in a government. The two forms of fragility began to resemble each other. In Washington, a shift in tone was also underway. The United States had intervened in the Caribbean basin for decades, with Marines, gunboats, and the language of protecting life and property. But the world was changing. The memory of occupation was sour in Latin America, and the rising storm in Europe required allies more than resentments. Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy promised less direct military meddling. It was a change in method, not a retreat from interest. When uniformed intervention became less fashionable, influence dressed itself in paperwork, loans, trade, and diplomacy. Power did not vanish. It learned to wear gloves. For United Fruit, this was a welcome evolution. A company did not want to rely on Marines as a routine business tool. It wanted local governments to police themselves in ways that made foreign force unnecessary. The best form of control is the kind that feels, to the controlled, like their own choice. The company's ideal partner was not an American commander, but a local ruler who could deliver stability and silence. In Guatemala, such a ruler emerged with the confidence of a man who believed that order was a personal virtue. Jorge Ubico came to power in the early 1930s and ruled with an authoritarian certainty that appealed to foreign investors and frightened domestic opponents. He admired efficiency and distrusted dissent. He wore uniforms like arguments. Under his regime, the state did not so much negotiate with large foreign firms as align itself with them. Ubico's Guatemala was a country with old social hierarchies and new economic ambitions. Land was concentrated. Rural labor was cheap by design. The indigenous majority lived under burdens inherited from conquest and preserved by modern law. To foreign companies, the country offered what the market calls predictability and what citizens often experience as coercion. United Fruit benefited richly. Concessions and exemptions meant the company paid little in taxes while controlling critical infrastructure. It held enormous tracts of land, much of it unused, not because the company had forgotten it, but because land in such a system is not only for cultivation. It is for leverage, for future expansion, for keeping competitors out, for ensuring that a government cannot easily threaten you without threatening itself. The company's grip on Guatemala's Atlantic port and rail connections tightened the old theme: whoever manages the corridor manages the treasury. The company also learned, under dictatorships like Ubico's, how deeply a state can be shaped without appearing to be owned. The arrangement could be presented as a national development strategy. Roads and rail lines existed, exports flowed. The capital could boast of modernity. The countryside paid the bill in wages, landlessness, and the quiet resignation that grows when politics is treated as a spectator sport. Then came the Second World War, which rearranged everything without necessarily improving it. Wartime logistics elevated certain commodities and certain routes. It hardened the habit of viewing foreign regions through the lens of strategic necessity. Even a banana corridor could be imagined, in wartime and then in the Cold War that followed, as part of a larger map of security. The language of commerce began to borrow the language of defense. When the war ended, Guatemala did not return to its old equilibrium. The pressure that had been accumulating under Ubico, students, teachers, professionals, parts of the officer corps, found expression. In 1944, protests surged. Ubico resigned. A brief attempt at succession collapsed. A new movement, later remembered as a revolution with more hope than blood, pushed forward. What followed was a rare thing in the region's political history, a decade in which electoral legitimacy mattered, and reform was not merely a slogan. Juan José Arevalo became president in 1945, bringing an agenda of social modernization, education, labor rights, a broader concept of citizenship. His government was not communist. It was reformist and nationalist, the kind of experiment that makes entrenched interests nervous precisely because it appears reasonable. For United Fruit and the local elites, who had learned to live comfortably under Ubico, this was an unwelcome novelty. A labor code that recognized unions and regulated working conditions was, to a corporation, a threat to cost control and managerial autonomy. To workers, it was the first legal acknowledgement that their grievances were not simply personal failings. In the banana zones, this translated into organization, demands, and the first serious attempts to bring the company's private sovereignty under public rule. The company adapted where it could. It negotiated, conceded in small ways, resisted in others. It understood that a reform government could be more dangerous than a chaotic one because it might actually build institutions, courts, tax systems, labor protections that endure. Chaos can be managed. Competence must be answered. In 1951, the presidency passed to Jacobo Arbenz. He had been an officer in the army and had participated in the 1944 movement. He was more austere than Arevalo, less theatrical, and more focused on economic structure. He looked at Guatemala and saw a country rich in land and poor in opportunity, a state dependent on customs receipts, and a national economy trapped by monopolies, some domestic, some foreign. His diagnosis was blunt. Guatemala could not be sovereign in any practical sense, while its best land lay idle under private control, and its transport arteries were governed by a foreign corporation. He did not speak of abolishing capitalism. He spoke of creating it, of turning landless peasants into small producers, of building roads and ports that would free the state from a single company's choke points, of modernizing agriculture so the nation could develop an internal market rather than remain an export appendage. This was, from one angle, an entirely orthodox project of national development. From another angle, it was an assault on the hidden architecture of the Banana Republic, the enclosure of land, the privatization of corridors, and the habit of treating the treasury as something that must accommodate the company rather than the reverse. In 1952, Arbenz's government moved from diagnosis to law. The Agrarian Reform Decree, Decree 900, was passed with the seriousness of men who believed they were changing the country's century-long argument about land. It targeted large holdings of uncultivated acreage and proposed to redistribute idle land to the land poor, compensating owners with bonds based on declared tax value. In a society where land had been hoarded, underreported, and treated as political capital, this detail was not a footnote. It was a fuse. For years, companies and landowners had declared low values for tax purposes. It was ordinary, almost polite, a shared fiction between property and state. Now the state announced that it would take that fiction at face value and pay compensation accordingly. Guatemala's reform was not only a policy, it was a trap set by arithmetic, sprung by law. United Fruit was the largest single landholder in Guatemala, and much of its land sat unused, held for future expansion or to keep rivals away. The government expropriated substantial uncultivated acreage and offered compensation in bonds based on the company's own stated tax valuations. The amount was, by the company's judgment, insulting. By the government's judgment, it was the logical consequence of the company's tax behavior. The dispute that followed was not merely about money, it was about precedence. If Guatemala succeeded in reclaiming land from a foreign corporation, other countries might try the same. If workers and peasants saw that a government could stand up to the company, they might ask why their own governments had not. The company understood that the battlefield was wider than Guatemala. Inside corporate offices, the argument turned from negotiation to containment. The company's problem was that it had always insisted it was simply a business. Guatemala was forcing it to behave like a political actor in open daylight, and political actors require allies. The first ally was Washington, not as a monolith, but as a landscape. Agencies, diplomats, senators, editors, the informal republic of lunches and briefings where facts are introduced into circulation. United Fruit had cultivated this landscape for years through normal channels: lawyers, lobbyists, relationships built on the common language of investment. Now it intensified the effort. It recruited the kind of men who could make a private grievance sound like a public emergency. Thomas Corcoran, a Washington insider with a reputation earned in the New Deal years, represented the company's interests with the fluency of a man who understood that policy often follows mood. The company also leaned on public relations, where a different kind of influence could be manufactured. Edward Bernays, famous for turning advertising into something closer to social engineering, understood that modern politics is often the art of associating images before it is the art of winning arguments. Guatemala, he recognized, would not be sold to Americans as a complicated dispute about land valuation and national development. It would be sold as a moral and strategic parable. In the early Cold War, the most useful label for discrediting a government was also the most elastic: communist. Guatemala did have a communist party, small but active. It did have leftist organizers and officials who supported the agrarian reform. In a country where peasants had been excluded for generations, any serious land reform required an organized push from below, and organized pushes attract ideological cadres. Arbenz himself was not a communist doctrinaire, but in the climate of the early 1950s, nuance was not an ally. It was a weakness to be exploited. Bernays arranged tours for American journalists, sponsored fact-finding trips that were, in practice, exercises in guided perception. He cultivated correspondents and columnists, fed stories to newswires, and helped create an atmosphere in which Guatemala's domestic reforms could be interpreted as an outpost of Soviet ambition. The company's grievance about land became, in the public mind, a question about national security. This was the new form of corporate power, not a gunboat, but a headline, not a concession signed under a ceiling fan, but a consensus shaped in air-conditioned rooms thousands of miles away. The Banana Republic was learning to live in the age of mass media. The United States government was also shifting. The Truman administration had viewed Guatemala with concern and had flirted with covert options. Under Eisenhower, the vocabulary of containment hardened. The administration was filled with men for whom the world's map was divided into zones of influence, and for whom the moral risk of another loss to communism felt intolerable. In such a climate, a small Central American republic could become, in the imagination of policymakers, a test case. There were also the quieter connections that, without proving conspiracy, established sympathy. Powerful law firms that had represented corporations abroad produced officials who now directed policy. Business leaders moved in and out of government. Some men who helped decide Guatemala's fate would later take positions with the very company whose interests were at stake. Even where personal ties were overstated by later polemic, the institutional alignment was real. A worldview in which protection of American investment overseas was treated as a natural function of the state. In Guatemala City, Arbenz pressed forward, trying to do what reformers always try to do and rarely manage, to change the structure of the country without provoking a coalition strong enough to crush the change. He attempted to keep the army loyal, to keep the reform legal, to keep foreign investors from panicking, to keep the Communist Party from dominating the government's public face. Each effort came with its own compromises, and compromises are visible to enemies as weakness. The company and its allies did not need to prove that Guatemala was a Soviet puppet. They needed only to persuade enough Americans that it might be, and enough Guatemalan officers that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. In politics, the appearance of inevitability can be more decisive than reality. The American ambassador sent to Guatemala in this period, John Purifoy, did not behave like a neutral diplomat observing a domestic experiment. He behaved like a man tasked with ending it. He pressed hard, demanded concessions, and made clear that the United States viewed Guatemala's direction as unacceptable. Diplomacy became a form of pressure, and pressure became part of a larger operation. That operation, planned and directed through the CIA, was designed to remove Arbenz without an overt American invasion. The code name has a bureaucratic chill, as if it were a shipping schedule. PBSUCESS. It combined training and funding of exiles, psychological warfare, sabotage, diplomatic isolation, and the careful cultivation of fear within Guatemala's officer corps. The leader chosen for the exile force was Carlos Castillo Armas, a Guatemalan officer who had opposed the revolution and fled. He was not, by military standards, a formidable commander. That was not the point. The operation did not require him to win a conventional war. It required him to be the face on which a narrative could be hung: liberation, restoration, the end of communism. Training camps were established outside Guatemala, particularly in Honduras, where local authorities were cooperative. Men were recruited, armed, instructed. Lists were made. Plans were drafted for sabotage and intimidation. The real weight of the operation lay not in the size of the invading force, but in the machinery around it: planes, radio broadcasts, rumor campaigns, the readiness to make Guatemala's leaders feel isolated. Inside Guatemala, the situation grew tighter. The agrarian reform had empowered peasants and organized labor, which thrilled the supporters and terrified the landowners. The traditional elites, the church hierarchy in many quarters, and parts of the business community viewed Arbenz as an existential threat. Some officers worried not only about ideology, but about hierarchy itself. A government that mobilizes peasants and workers is a government that can eventually challenge the military's traditional role. The army, the final arbiter in many Latin American states, became a court in which both sides sought a verdict. In June 1954, the operation moved into its decisive phase. Castillo Armas's force crossed into Guatemala from neighboring territory. It was small, scattered, and in purely military terms, vulnerable. Guatemalan forces could have crushed it had they moved decisively. But decisive movement requires confidence, and confidence had been undermined. A clandestine radio station began broadcasting dramatic reports of rebel victories, defections, and unstoppable momentum. The broadcasts were designed less to inform than to hypnotize, to create the sensation that resistance was already futile. Air raids by U.S.-backed pilots struck targets near the capital and strategic points, producing panic out of proportion to physical damage. The bombs were not only weapons, they were messages. The Guatemalan public heard of rebel columns larger than the reality. Officers heard that colleagues were defecting when they were not. Ministers heard that foreign invasion was imminent. The atmosphere thickened with uncertainty, and in uncertainty, institutions often choose the safest course. They step aside. Arbenz faced a dilemma that has destroyed many reformers. If he armed the popular organizations, the peasants and workers who supported him, he might repel the invasion but provoke the army to depose him in fear of social revolution. If he relied solely on the army, he risked betrayal. The reformer, trying to build a modern state, discovers that the old state still holds the guns. He tried to hold the center. He attempted to command the army, to maintain constitutional order, to avoid civil war. But the pressure campaign was aimed precisely at making the center collapse. Officers who believed the United States would intervene overtly if the rebels failed began to calculate their own survival. Better, in such thinking, to remove the president and restore relations than to fight a losing war against a superpower. On June 27, 1954, Arbenz resigned. His resignation speech, delivered with a controlled bitterness, framed the crisis as a foreign aggression carried out through proxies and propaganda. He spoke not like a man admitting defeat, but like a man describing the terms on which he had been defeated. It was the voice of a leader discovering that sovereignty can be strangled without occupation. What followed was a quick sequence of military reshufflings that looked, on the surface, like domestic events and felt, beneath, like choreography. A junta formed. Negotiations occurred under heavy American influence. Purifoy pressed Guatemalan officers with the confidence of a man whose side held the decisive weight. Within weeks, Castillo Armas entered the capital as victor, though his victory was less a conquest than a transfer of power made possible by psychological and diplomatic force. The new regime moved swiftly to undo what had been done. Agrarian reform was halted and reversed. Land was returned to old owners and foreign companies. Labor organizations were suppressed. Political opponents were arrested or driven into exile. Lists of communists and sympathizers were compiled and used not only against actual party members, but against reformers, union leaders, and anyone associated with the previous decade's hopes. United Fruit's immediate interests were protected. Its land position improved. Its political environment returned to something closer to the old arrangement, a government eager to prove its reliability to Washington and investors. The corridor remained in friendly hands. The bank had foreclosed on the attempt to change the terms of the loan, but the deeper consequences were not so tidy. The decade of reform had awakened expectations among peasants and workers, expectations of dignity, land, and citizenship. The coup crushed those expectations not by persuading people they were wrong, but by proving they could be punished for having them. The social energies that had briefly moved through legal channels did not evaporate. They retreated into other forms. Guatemala entered years in which political conflict became more brutal and less visible. Military regimes followed. Opposition radicalized. Violence spread into the countryside. Over the long arc that followed, the country suffered a civil conflict whose cruelty would make the earlier decades' hopes seem, in memory, almost impossibly tender. The coup of 1954 did not invent Guatemala's problems, but it closed one path for addressing them and left the nation to walk darker ones. In Washington and in corporate offices, the operation was regarded as a success of method. It demonstrated that a small country could be reshaped without a formal invasion, that radio and rumor could be as useful as rifles, that diplomatic pressure could replace gunboats, and that public relations could soften the moral discomfort of intervention. It was not merely a one-time act. It was a rehearsal for a new style of power. The banana itself remained unchanged, pale, sweet, ordinary. It continued to arrive in American cities as if it had always belonged there. Children ate it without thinking of Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, or Colombia. That was the final triumph of the system. It made a complex machinery of land, labor, coercion, and persuasion disappear behind the simplicity of a snack. What had been constructed over 6 decades was not simply a successful corporation. It was a model of how private enterprise can, in weak states, assume functions we associate with government: building infrastructure, managing populations, shaping revenue, influencing diplomacy, while still insisting it is merely doing business. It governed without claiming to govern. It owned without using the language of ownership. It relied on local rulers when convenient, and when local rulers threatened the arrangement, it found ways, through Washington, through propaganda, through covert action, to replace them. The phrase "banana republic" endured because it captured the comedy and the tragedy of this arrangement at once. It sounded like an insult fit for a barroom joke, and it described an economy serious enough to topple governments. It suggested slapstick, petty coups, loud generals, cheap fruit, and concealed the sophisticated reality. A state's sovereignty can be hollowed out not only by foreign flags, but by contracts, corridors, and the control of cash flow. By 1954, the evolution was complete. The company that had begun by learning to move a perishable fruit on schedule had learned to move something more delicate still: the perception of legitimacy. It had learned that the strongest walls are not always built of stone or steel, but of assumptions about what is reasonable, what is safe, what is extreme, what is foreign, what is subversive. When those assumptions are shaped from afar, a small nation can find itself living inside a story written elsewhere. And so the banana, that curve of sunlight on a northern table, carried within it a quiet lesson of the 20th century, that modern power often prefers not to conquer territory, but to manage the terms on which territory is allowed to govern itself.